Welcome to the session on rounding numbers, rounding to the nearest 10, 100 and 1000. The objectives for this session are learning how to explain what rounding means, round to the nearest 10, 100 and 1000, and justify rounding decisions using the next digit. What does rounding mean? To round a number means to approximate the number to a given value. When we round, we replace a number with a nearby number that is easier to work with. The rounded number is not exact, but it should be close to the original. So essentially, rounding means finding the nearest value. And we round to make things or numbers simpler while staying close to the original number. Take, for example, 47. This rounds to 50 to the nearest 10. And 447 rounds to 400 to the nearest 100. Before we get into the technicalities, let's review the place value chart. This place value chart shows the names of each position. From right to left, we have ones or units, tens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s. Each place to the left is 10 times greater than the place to its right. Here's the number 43,285 in the chart. This will help you identify the units, tens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s, and it will also help with rounding. Let's take a look at the key rule. To round, identify the place you are rounding to, then look at the digit immediately to the right. If it is 0 to 4, round down. If it is 5 to 9, then round up. To round to the nearest 10, we focus on the tens and ones places. We check the units digit to decide whether the tens digit stays the same or increases by 1. The units digit becomes 0. Let's take a look at some examples. 73 is rounded to 70 to the nearest 10. 78 is rounded to 80 to the nearest 10. Let's look at these examples in more details in the next few slides. So when rounding to the nearest 10, we look at the units digit. If the digit is less than 5, then we round down and leave the tens digit as it is. If the units digit is greater than or equal to 5, then we round up and add 1 to the tens digit. We also change the units digit to 0. So let's look at our examples again in more detail. We are required to round 73 to the nearest 10. So let's consider 73. Our tens position is here. Since we're rounding to the nearest 10, this is the one we first consider. Then we look to the right of this, the number 3. We ask ourselves, is this value greater than or equal to 5? Clearly, 3 is not greater than or equal to 5. So we leave the 7 as it is. And as shown here, we leave this 7 as it is. And now we can round 73. Therefore, 73 rounds to 70 to the nearest 10. The digits after the one you are rounding to become 0. Now let's round 75 to the nearest 10. Here's the tens position, and we look at the units and ask ourselves, is this value greater than or equal to 5? In this example, it is, yes. So we change the 7 to an 8. This 7 is changed to 8. And therefore, 75 rounds to 80 to the nearest 10. Notice that the digits after the one you are rounding to become 0. So the units become 0. Now for another example. We're going to consider 84 and round that to the nearest 10. Here's the tens position. And in the units, we ask ourselves, is this value greater than or equal to 5? No, it's not. Therefore, we leave the 8 as it is. So this 8 here is left as it is. And therefore, 84 rounds to 80 to the nearest 10. Again, the digits after the one you are rounding to become 0. Now we're required to round 146 to the nearest 10. So let's consider 146. The tens position is here. In the units position, we look at this value and ask ourselves, is this value greater than or equal to 5? Yes, it is. So now we change the 4 to a 5. And therefore 146 rounds to 150 to the nearest 10. Since the digits after the one you are rounding to become 0, as shown here. Now let's look at a slightly trickier example. We are required to round 96 to the nearest 10. So here's our tens position. And we ask ourselves, is the units value here greater than or equal to 5? Yes, it is. So now we add 1 to the 9. Now, when we add 1 to 9, it becomes 10. So we change the 9 to 0 and add 1 to the hundreds column. And therefore, 96 rounds to 100 to the nearest 10. Notice that the digits after the one you are rounding to become 0. So here's our rounded number. Now for another tricky example, we are required to round 199 to the nearest 10. So let's consider 199. Here's the tens position, and we look at the units position and ask, is this value greater than or equal to 5? Yes, it is in this example. So we add 1 to the 9 in the tens column. Now 9 plus 1 equals 10, so we change the 9 to 0 and add 1 to the hundreds column. And adding 1 to the hundreds column means we change the 1 to 2. So therefore 199 rounds to 200 to the nearest 10. Notice that this digit here, after the tens column, has become 0 for the purposes of rounding. Now we look at rounding to the nearest 100. To round to the nearest hundreds, we focus on the hundreds and tens places. We check the tens digit to decide whether the hundreds digit stays the same or increases by 1. The tens and units digit becomes 0. So let's take a look at an example or some examples. 342 is rounded to 300 to the nearest 100. 378 is rounded to 400 to the nearest 100. So let's look at the theory again. When rounding to 100, look at the tens digit. If the tens digit is less than 5, then round down. So leave hundreds digit as it is. If the tens digit is greater than or equal to 5, then round up. So add 1 to the hundreds digit. And then change the tens and units digits to 0. So let's take a look at some examples. We are required to round 342 to the nearest 100. So let's consider 342. Remember, because we're rounding to the nearest 100, which is here, this is the hundreds position, we look to the right of this and examine the tens column. So this place, we ask, is this value greater than or equal to 5? Clearly, it's 4. No, the value is not greater than or equal to 5. So we leave the 3 as it is. In other words, we leave this 3 as it is. And so 342 rounds to 300 to the nearest 100. Notice that the digits after the one you are rounding to become 0. So remember, we were rounding to the nearest 100. Everything after that becomes 0. Now we're required to round 378 to the nearest 100. So let's consider this number. Here's the hundreds position, and we have to examine the value in the tens position. So we're asking, is this value greater than or equal to 5? Yes, clearly 7 is greater than or equal to 5. Therefore, we change the 3 to 4. So this 3 here gets changed to 4. Therefore, 378 rounds to 400 to the nearest 100. And we change the tens and units digits to 0, as shown here. Now let's round 2,764 to the nearest 100. So let's consider this number. Here's the hundreds position, and we ask ourselves, is the value in the tens position greater than or equal to 5? Clearly 6 is indeed greater than or equal to 5, so therefore we change the 7 to 8. In particular, this is the 7 we change to 8. And therefore 2,764 rounds to 2,800 to the nearest 100. Notice the units and the tens digits are also now 0. Let's now take a look at a tricky example. We are required to round 47 to the nearest 100. So let's consider 47. Notice that the hundreds position is here, and there's nothing placed in the hundreds position. So therefore we now ask ourselves, is the value next to it on its right greater than or equal to 5? Clearly 4 is not greater than or equal to 5, therefore we leave nothing in the hundreds column. We don't add 1, we leave it as it is. And therefore 47 rounds to 00 to the nearest 100. Notice that the digits after the one you are rounding to become 0. And clearly we don't actually write 00 in real life, we just write a single 0, as shown here. Now let's take a look at rounding to the nearest 1,000. To round to the nearest thousand, we look at the thousands digit and then check the hundreds digit. The hundreds digit tells us whether we stay at the lower thousand or round up to the next one. So do we keep or add 1 to the thousands digit? And then after this, we change the hundreds, tens, and units to 0. Let's take a look at some examples. 3,402 rounds down to 3,000. 3,692 rounds up to 4,000. Now let's round to the nearest thousand. When rounding to 1,000 or the nearest thousand, look at the hundreds digit. If the hundreds digit is less than 5, then round down. In other words, leave the thousands digit as it is. If the hundreds digit is greater than or equal to 5, then round up. In other words, add 1 to the thousands digit. And then we change the hundreds, tens, and units digits to 0. Let's take a look at some examples. We are required to round 3,402 to the nearest 1,000. So let's examine this figure. Here's the thousands position. And here's the hundreds position. We ask ourselves, is this value greater than or equal to 5? Clearly, 4 is not greater than or equal to 5. Therefore, we leave the 3 as it is. So in other words, this 3 is left as it is. And 3,402 rounds to 3,000, to the nearest thousand. Notice the hundreds, units, and tens have all become 0. Now let's take a look at another example. We are required to round 3,692 to the nearest 1,000. So let's consider this number. Here's the thousands position, and to the right of that is the hundreds position, and we're asking the question, is this value greater than or equal to 5? And indeed the 6 is greater than or equal to 5, therefore we change the 3 to a 4. In particular, it's this 3 that we change to 4. And therefore, 3,692 rounds to 4,000 to the nearest thousand. Notice again the digits after the thousands position, in other words, the hundreds, the tens, the units positions have all become 0. And now for another example. Let's round 18,499 to the nearest 1,000. So let's consider this figure. Here's the thousands position. There's an 8 here. And to the right of that is the number 4. And this is in the hundreds position. We're asking the question, is this value greater than or equal to 5? And clearly 4 is not greater than or equal to 5. So therefore we leave the 8 as it is. And so 18,499 rounds to 18,000 to the nearest thousand. Notice the units, tens, and hundreds have all become 0. A useful habit is to check that your rounded number makes sense. Consider the two nearest options and decide which one the original number is closest to. So a rounded number should be close to the original. And you need to check this by thinking, is it closer to the lower option or the higher option? So for example, 18,499 is closer to 18,000 than 19,000. Now pause the slideshow and have a go at these exercises. Round each number to the nearest 10. The solutions will be released one at a time, so you can check your answers as you go along. Pause the slideshow whenever you need to. Remember, when rounding to the nearest 10, the units digit determines whether you round up or down. Now pause the slideshow and have a go at these exercises. Round each number to the nearest 100. The solutions will be released one at a time, so you can check your answers as you go along. Pause the slideshow whenever you need to. When rounding to the nearest 100, the tens digit is the deciding digit. Now pause the slideshow and have a go at these exercises. Round each number to the nearest 1000. Again, the solutions will be released one at a time, so you can check your answers as you go along. Pause the slideshow whenever you need to. When rounding to the nearest 1000, the hundreds digit is the deciding digit. Now pause the slideshow and have a go at these exercises. The same number can round differently depending on the place requested. The solutions will be released one at a time, so you can check your answers as you go along. Pause the slideshow whenever you need to. Notice that 12,450 stays the same when rounding to the nearest 10, because it is already a multiple of 10. Also note that when rounding to the nearest 1000, 12,450 rounds down because the hundreds digit is 4. Now pause the slideshow and have a go at these slightly more challenging exercises. However, only attempt these if you are really confident. The same number notice can round differently depending on the place requested. Again, the solutions will be released one at a time, so you can check your answers as you go along. Pause the slideshow whenever you need to. For part 1, the ones digit is 1, so we round to the nearest multiple of 10. So 999 to the nearest 10 is 990. For part 2, the tens digit is 9, so we round up from 991 to 1000. And for part 3, 991 to the nearest 1000 is 1000. And now for the rest of the solutions. This brings us to the end of this session. Do attempt some additional exercises from your teacher or your textbook related to this topic. Thank you very much for listening.